Hello, 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 and welcome to the second part of Good Morning Gwinnett. I'm sorry about the delay, y'all. We got some technical things that happened, but that's okay. I'm excited to have my guest on today because she's going to be talking to us about she's going to be talking to us about Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina. And when you hear Hurricane Katrina, a lot of times the first thing we think of is New Orleans. Because when I heard it, the first thing I said was I was just in New Orleans in July, which I was, and I was so amazed at all the work they had done. And the publicist said to me, no, 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 we're not talking about New Orleans. We're talking about Mississippi. So without further ado, and I know you guys have been waiting a few minutes, but that's okay because now she's here. Dr. Davis, welcome to the Good Morning with Net show.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me to Good Morning Gwinnett.
You're very, very welcome. And I know we had a little bit of technical problems getting there or some time scheduling problems, but that's okay. I'm glad to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So now you live in Mississippi?
I don't. I am originally from the state of Mississippi. I grew up in the Delta in Mississippi and it's always been in my heart. So even though I didn't live there when Katrina happened, it was on my heart. And that's why this book is all about. That's what this book is all about.
You know, when Sharon reached out to me about having you on the show, and by the way, guys, this show is being streamed live right now, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Roku. So if you have a Roku device, be sure to turn it on. If you want to watch it on your TV, download the Noise Media app to your TV, and you can watch us live on your television. So we are live all over the place. We're in about 100 countries, Dr. Davis. So thank you for being here and sharing this story about Katrina with us.
Thank you. It's great to share this great platform that you have.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. You know, it's when Sharon reached out to me about having you on the show, the first thing when she said Katrina, the first thing I said was New Orleans. I was like, I was just there, you know, I went on the tour, the Ninth Ward, and she's like, nope, there were other places affected by Katrina other than New Orleans. And she said Mississippi was one of those places. And I was like, oh, because we didn't hear a lot about Mississippi in the news. Everything was about New Orleans, and that's because so much devastation. But I want you to tell people about, you know, what your story about the book, Overlooked Voices of Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, the resilience and recovery of Mississippi black women. And why black women only? Because I'm sure it was more people affected than just black women.
That is so true. You know, why Mississippi? Mississippi is only 45 minutes from New Orleans. Most people don't really go to Mississippi. They know of the big city, New Orleans. But I knew that when the hurricane hit, that whatever what happened to New Orleans had to have happened to Mississippi because they're so close and they share that Atlantic Gulf of Mexico water that comes in. And so I did originally interview women who were from Mississippi, Black, white, and others. But after I looked at the research, you know, I'm a researcher, trained researcher. So after I looked at the research showed that all the studies, all the focus, just like you said, was on New Orleans. And I said, nope, I'm going to narrow this down. I'm going to only look at Mississippi. I'm going to only tell the Mississippi Black women's stories because most people know the New Orleans Black people women's stories, and their stories are important, but so are the Mississippi women's stories.
And so when you did the book, how did you determine which women to actually talk to? Did you put out a call for women? Did you know, go around town and knock on doors? How did you find the women to talk to?
Yeah, you know, 2 months. Katrina happened August 29th, 2005. And 2 months, well, even before 2 months, I reached out to women who lived on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and I tried to find them and they connected me to other women. And one woman led me to another woman, and one white woman led me to one woman, and one Black woman led me to another woman, and some Black women led me to white women. It was just a big mix. So then I said, again, after looking at the literature, I found these women from people to people to people. Each woman linked me to another woman. And then I narrowed it down again because the research showed nobody was studying Black women from Mississippi. Some people were studying other women, but I said, I'm just going to study Black women from Mississippi. And now we finally have in the Katrina narrative a book about Mississippi Black women's resilience and recovery.
You know, I applaud you for being still connected to Mississippi. I have a client, she's a pastor and she's from Panther Burn. and she loves Mississippi. She lives in Georgia, but she loves Mississippi, and she does a lot for Mississippi from the state of
Well, you
Georgia.
know, at the time, yeah, and at the time I lived in Boston. And
Wow.
yeah, but I was like, you know what? Something happened in Mississippi, and I'm going to find out how those women fared. And that's how this happened. So I can understand her connection to Mississippi too.
Oh, she loves it. Anytime something happens, she called me yesterday. It was funny. I was in a meeting, and when she called me, I was like, "Is it an emergency?" She said to me, "Do you know Tyler Perry?" And I was like, no. She said, "I'm trying to get somebody to get me to Tyler Perry because we got some people that need some help in Mississippi." And so she loves Mississippi. That's her home, and she has Georgia's my home. I was raised in Jersey. I have an affinity for both, so I get it. Um, in your research, one of the stories I read was about a young lady who stayed behind because of her dad, right? And we always say things like, well, why didn't you leave when they said leave? And she said because of her dad. Tell us a little bit about that story, because I found that to be very interesting. And I could see me not leaving my mom. If she said, I'm not going, I would be like, I'm not going either. So,
Yeah. Well, I thank you for asking me specifically about one of the women. Sometimes people ask me to pick one of the women, and that's really hard. So I can talk about this woman's story. Well, just like you said, like most of us, when our parents tell us to do something, we generally do it. And so she was getting ready to go, and she had called all her family members saying, look, you got to get out of here. This storm has changed its course, and the weather forecast is different. So you all have to go. And so she told her dad and her friend at the time, who is now her husband, she said that, look, we have to get out of here. We're not safe. And her dad told her, look, I built this house. It's made of stucco. And not only that, it survived Katrina, Camille, which was the worst storm before Katrina. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. And they had to revamp and figure out how to stay there, the three of them together, and weather through Katrina, which was a nightmare for her, as you read in the book, her descriptions of what happened.
yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine. I'm freaked out about tornadoes, and it's so crazy, Dr. Davis, because I was born in Georgia, but I was raised in Jersey. So the worst we had was a blizzard.
Yeah.
And so when I moved back to Georgia, I had this huge fear of tornadoes. And I remember one particular night, I was watching television, and emergency news flash came across the screen, and it said a tornado was about 3 miles away from the house. And I jumped up and I freaked out. And my mom lived with me, and she was partially disabled. So I said to her, come on, we got to go. It's a tornado coming. And she was like, I'm not going anywhere. I said, listen, let's go. We got to get you down the stairs. There's a tornado coming. And I got her downstairs. And so by the time my husband and my uncle got downstairs, my mom and I were sitting inside of a closet with bike helmets on our head watching the news. So I get it. I would have definitely stayed with my mom. So I totally understand that. I think about all the businesses that were lost in Hurricane Katrina. Were any of the women that you profile, were they business owners, and how did they fare through that whole thing and trying to bounce back?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking it. Yes, there were several of the women in this study who owned businesses. And one of the women, I want to just read a little note about her story, because this woman is the only woman in the group of women that are in the book that has passed away. And
No.
of her, I would like to just read just a little bit of her story about what happened to her after the business. You were talking about businesses. And so
Okay.
I want to read a little bit of Jean's story, and I won't be long, I promise. Jean says, well, before Katrina, I worked as a cosmetologist for 21 years, but my shop went down with the storm. And I wasn't going to read a long quote, but I wanted to just address this. Several of these women owned businesses. Another two women owned businesses. Their businesses were wiped out completely after Katrina. Because one thing about that storm that most people don't know is that hurricanes spin counterclockwise, backward. We would call it backward. So whatever is on the back side of the storm gets hit worse, and they fare worse. So the entire infrastructure of the Mississippi Gulf Coast was completely demolished. So these women, several of them owned businesses, and they lost their businesses, their homes. Thank God none of these women lost family members. But yes, they lost businesses, they lost homes. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, since this is a longitudinal study, meaning 15-year long study, I wanted to show the women's resilience and their recovery, not just the chaotic aftermath of the storm. They had that, all of them, with the loss of their homes and their businesses. But I wanted to also show how they were resilient. And that is the piece that I get to a little bit later in the book.
And you know, I like that, because I was saying to myself, why did it take 15 years to do the study? But because I guess you followed them throughout that time to see where they are now. I love that part. So first of all, let's talk about what the Mississippi Gulf Coast, what does that entails? Like what, because I think people hear that, and when I hear it, I just think Gulf Coast, I think water. But when it comes to town, what towns are along the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to start with New Orleans because most people know that.
Mm-hmm.
Another city that most people know is Mobile, Alabama. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so between New Orleans and Mobile is the entire shoreline, which is 86 miles long on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Starts with the little town called Bay St. Louis. From Bay St. Louis, you keep going to you just go down the coastline, you get to the bigger cities, and one of them would be Biloxi. Most
Mm-hmm.
people would have heard of that. Another one would be Gulfport, Mississippi. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
people have heard of that. And even with Hurricane Ida that just passed, they had reporters to finally go over to Gulfport and Biloxi in Mississippi. And if you keep going, you get to D'Iberville and you get to other small towns that most people won't know. But the reason people know Gulfport and Biloxi is because Gulfport is the largest city in Mississippi. Most people don't know that. It's the largest city in Mississippi. And Biloxi, they both have casinos lining the ocean front. And that whole Gulf Coast area, 86 miles of it, is a resort area where people go for vacations. It's kind of how I got familiar with the Mississippi Gulf Coast because I didn't grow up down there, but I grew up in the Delta area. And we would go down, my family, my dad and mom and sisters would go down to the Gulf Coast area for like a vacation because it was the beach, the sunny beach and palm trees, which are indigenous to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So we would go there, and that's the Gulf Coast area. So think about New Orleans, and then you go through small towns, and then you get to Gulfport, then you get to Biloxi, and then you keep going, a few more 48 miles, and you get to Mobile, Alabama. So that's kind of the shoreline. And I show people that in the book because I knew, like you said, people wouldn't be familiar with the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Wow, I didn't even know that, and that's so crazy because when you think about when I think about Alabama, I think about Georgia, Alabama, because they're right next to each other. But then Alabama hits Mississippi and Tennessee, and it's
Mississippi
crazy.
is in the middle of them, New Orleans, and then Mississippi, and then Alabama.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So now you followed the women for 15 years. What have they been up to over the last 15 years, and how have they built back better?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Over the last 15 years, I would contact them regularly to see how they were doing, interview them, and keep going with that. And so the first 1 to 3 years were pretty tough. You know, they lost a lot. They lost their homes. They had to remodel their homes. They had to do a lot of work there, and they had to find new jobs, a lot of them too. And over time, though, their resilience was evident. And what I do in the book is I use womanist theory, which is Alice Walker, the Black woman writer and poet that most people are familiar with her work, kind of like
Mhm.
Toni Morrison's work. But I used Alice Walker's womanism to show how the women were able to be resilient and move themselves through resilience to complete recovery. So they've rebuilt their homes, they've found new jobs. Some of them have gotten remarried. Some of them now go on vacations like they used to before Katrina, since they have rebuilt their lives. They have built new businesses. That's the other thing. All of them still, primarily, all of them still live on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So they didn't move away like other places with hurricanes and disasters. They wanted to be there. They wanted to go back home. And even though some of them lost, beachfront ocean homes and lost all of their possessions, they still rebuilt, they have recovered, and now they are resilient. And so I use Alice Walker's work to show the strength, the fortitude that these women had. And they said, you know what? I have to do what I have to do now. And if that means getting in a long line, getting ice in the early years, if that means going to get the right contractor to rebuild my house, I will do that. If that means helping my neighbors in my community, I will do that. So that's what they've done, and they've recovered.
Let me ask you this, because I was in New Orleans in July, and we took a tour over to the Ninth Ward. I swear to you, it was like two Ninth Wards. It was so crazy because we saw one Ninth Ward, which was predominantly Black, and then we saw the other Ninth Ward, which was predominantly other, right? And they looked like two different Ninth Wards. With the women that you interviewed and you did the study on, did you see any differences in the way that where they were located versus where other people were located? Because it was very evident in New Orleans that there were two Ninth Wards, and it was crazy because they were literally a few miles apart. One side looked like resort beautiful, the other side looked like it was still stuck in 2005, which was kind of crazy, and they were still trying to build it up. Did you see that in Mississippi?
Well, one of the things I'll say about the infrastructure first, and then I'll talk about the women's experiences and what they said. The infrastructure, if you go down the Mississippi Gulf Coast, those 86 miles that I talked about,
Mm-hmm.
the shoreline was absolutely beautiful with large old Victorian mansions. And some people say that's the good part of the storm, that it washed all those old Victorian mansions that line the ocean front away. But so the oceanfront area looks very different. It's not beautiful like it was. They had businesses galore. Many casinos were there. All the casinos didn't come back. Some are still there, but the entire ocean front for the 86 miles still looks very much like it looked after Katrina, just a little bit better, with some businesses coming back there, but not all of them. From the women's perspective, as far as the women that I found in Mississippi were a group of women who, again, one woman linked me to another woman to another woman. And what I noticed about the Mississippi women that I studied that and write about in the book is this. These women, as I describe in the book, they had college degrees. The majority of them had college degrees or some college experience, maybe, community college plus other. And they had businesses. They were married, the majority of these women. So the women in the book that I talk about are of a different group of women as opposed to the ones that mostly were shown in the Superdome. And
Mm-hmm.
so these women have been able to, they had insurance on their homes. They owned homes. That was another thing. Most of them owned homes. So they had insurance on their cars, their vehicles. They had management level jobs, most of them. So they were able to recover very differently. And we call it social stratification in the literature. And I talk about that in the book. So the status of these women was very different. And again, I didn't know who I was going to interview. I asked for an interview from any woman who would give me one. And the sample that God gave me was this group of women. So that's the difference in their stories, just when you try to answer the question that you asked me.
I think about what you said. I have a client. He is running for the insurance commissioner here for the state of Georgia, but he's also an insurance adjuster. So anytime there's a major storm anywhere in the United States, his company goes into high gear because they have to put out the claims. One of the things he told us about during his campaign, on his campaign trail, was that if you live in an area where it is likely to be a flood, a tornado, any kind of natural disaster, your insurance premiums and your deductibles are extremely high.
That's right.
And so, even, and I'm a financial advisor, nobody knows it because I don't talk about it very often, but I am. And so, whenever we try to get people to understand the importance of insurance, they kind of like, oh, it's that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So, when you look at people who were not so well put together as the women you profiled, what would be the message to them? Because I feel like if a lot of them had insurance in place, they would have recovered, even if it was something as simple as a renter's insurance, which a lot of people don't even know they should have, but you should, because if you have possessions in your home, you should be covered if there's a loss. So what would you say to those women? Because you talk to these women, they had insurance, they had houses, they knew they needed to protect their stuff. But I feel like a lot of people who don't own homes or they live in low income areas, they don't feel like they should have insurance. And I feel like that's such a misnomer that we have to get past to understand. Listen, insure your assets, no matter how small you think they are.
Yeah. I think I'm going to again go back to the women's stories because that is what the book is about. I think these women would say, get prepared today before there is a storm. And they say that. I'm just paraphrasing what they say right now. But they talk about the fact that do they have a disaster plan? They had a disaster evacuation plan prior to Katrina, but some of them couldn't enact it because family members, kept them back. But
Mhm.
they talk about now, some of them put away money, save money monthly so that for the emergency fund that they may need if another Katrina type storm comes. Others of them talk about having a place to go if another storm like that comes, meaning they will evacuate for sure. A lot of these women that I study evacuated. So they say they will leave again. And, trying to get yourself ready. You mentioned flood insurance. You can find out free if you live in a flood zone. All you have to do is go to a website called floodfactor.com. You go to floodfactor.com, it will tell you, put in your zip code, and it will tell you whether or not you live in a flood zone where all over the United States. And so that would tell you whether or not you need to get flood insurance, as you were mentioning. So the women tell stories like that in the book about how they think it's important to get ready. And that is a part of recovery and resilience, knowing what you will do if a storm like that approaches, like Ida, the one that approached this year. It was a pretty tough storm, too, not as bad as Katrina in Mississippi, but it was really bad in New Orleans area and in Louisiana. So the women in this story, in this book, tell stories like that about what they will do if another storm comes. And so I think that's the thing that I like to say to people, your audience, get prepared now. Even come up with a text tree in your family so people will know who texting, where you're going, how, if you're safe, that kind of thing. And women talk about that. That's part of the lessons learned from this story that can be helpful to your audience and most of us.
So did you bring these women together? Did they meet each other?
Some of them have met each other, but not all of them have met each other. I did have a focus group with some of the women one year I was there, and then another time I had a Zoom with a couple of the women. But I have to remember, and this is something that I like to always say when people ask me questions about the women. I know who the women are, but as a trained ethical researcher, I must keep their confidentiality. I must keep who they are confidential unless they decide that they would like the public to know who they are. And ethical researchers, that's the kind of research we're trained to do, and that I will only do as a cultural ethical researcher. So if they wanted to come, yes, I invited a couple of the women to a conference to me and with me. And I said, would you like to come with me? And one woman did. And so I've invited them to do different things with me. Some say no, and some, one or two might say yes. So I make sure that their confidentiality is always kept ethically sound so that if they want to out themselves, that's up to them. But I would never do that.
Okay, okay. Um, One thing I've noticed during the pandemic is that when the pandemic happened, a lot of things changed. A lot of people decided, you know what, this is not the life I want. Here's a new opportunity for me to live the life that I want. In your studies with the women, did anybody shift gears and say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do this thing over here because life can be short. I say can be short because it doesn't have to be short all the time, but it can be. Did any of them make a shift to do something totally different because they just the fact that they lived through Hurricane Katrina, they realized, that's not the life I want to live anyway. Let me do something different.
Yes, indeed. And I'm going to go back to the book again
Okay.
because I like to allow the women to come into the room, not just me kind of talk only about them.
Okay.
Uh, One of the women, Jean, and I want to find her story. She talks about, maybe I have to paraphrase her depending on time, but she talks about the storm came and she found herself working, and then of course she lost her job and she lost her business. And once she did that, she said that I found myself in a, well, I think I just found it. Yeah, I worked, I read that part. And she says, okay, right here. After coming back after Katrina, a friend told me about a meeting where women would talk about what's going on and what we could do to help, and especially women because they were so desperately in need after Katrina for affordable housing, senior services, childcare after the storm. I agreed to attend the meeting with the friend if she would pick me up because I didn't have a car. I know I knew then I was not going to just sit there on the sidelines and wait to see what would happen. I knew I had to do something. She said emphatically. First, I became the secretary of the group. Eventually, one thing led to another, and I became the leader of the group. And she started a women's group that is actually still in existence today. And it has been recognized by the National Organization for Women. It has been actually recognized by Miss Magazine and many other major
Wow.
organizations in this country.
Wow, Ms. Magazine, that's huge. That's big.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned over the last year, 2 years, is that sometimes you just have to learn from these experiences, no matter how devastating they may be. You have to step back for a second and say, okay, what have I learned from this experience? And so it sounds like she made a huge switch to the point where now she's recognizing Ms. Magazine. Now, listen, for those of you who don't know what Ms. Magazine is, it is a huge nationally, probably global syndicated magazine that has been around for years. So check it out. If you've never heard of Ms., go to any grocery store, it's on the shelf. So that's
Yeah,
that's
and it's a sister magazine, for women only, kind of like our magazine Essence. Then Miss Magazine is a magazine for all groups of people.
all groups of people, and that's huge, y'all. On the PR side of that, you get written up in a magazine like that or Essence, that's a big deal. So just know that that's not a big deal. That's a huge deal. Um, Dr. Davis, when you look at the women who went through Hurricane Katrina, right now, mental health is almost like a buzzword for us, right? Oh, it's mental. Ever since George Floyd and the pandemic, mental health is like a buzzword. Now it's popular. It's popular amongst many cultures, especially ours. Like before, you couldn't get us to go see a therapist for nothing, even if we needed to. Did any of the women feel like they suffered post-traumatic stress because of Hurricane Katrina? And if they did, how did they handle that? And where are they now with that process?
Yeah, I did ask the women a question about did they know of resources for counseling immediately after Katrina and about 4 to 5 years later. And a couple of them told me, yes, they knew of resources in the community for counseling for people who had money or people who didn't have money. And the resources continued to be there over the years. Whether or not Mississippians suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, my answer probably would be a yes, they did. And I can tell you this about myself. I was never in a disaster myself like Katrina, but I personally have secondary trauma now. So whenever there's a hurricane that's near the Mississippi Gulf Coast, I want to text the women and I want to call the women and I watch the storm. I'm a storm watcher now. And I especially watch the storms that come to the Mississippi Gulf Coast area. So in all likelihood, there was probably a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder or that kind of thing that happened with many people on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and New Orleans, and any storm or hurricane or tornado or any natural disaster that might happen. So I am almost sure. But I guess I want to answer the question in addition to that with this. I ground the study in Alice Walker's womanism. And I want to just read a little bit about what Alice Walker says about the strength, really, and who Black women are, because this book is about just Black women's and their resilience and recovery after Katrina. So Walker says this, Alice Walker says this: from the Black folklore of mothers and female children, you acting womanish. Usually it refers to audacious, courageous, and willful behavior, responsible, serious, and in charge woman. A woman who loves and appreciates, prefers her culture. Woman's emotional flexibility. She can laugh or cry. She has strength. She's committed to the survival and wholeness of the entire group of her people. And I could just go on and on with, I am reading directly from an Alice Walker quote. So though these women experienced, survived Katrina, they are now resilient because of who they are in their womanist orientation. So in spite of what the women experienced, what we know about Black women from Alice Walker's womanist orientation is they keep going and they get through those tough times.
So what is so how has the book been received so far? Because I know you're newly out there with the book. How has it been received so far?
Well, actually, the book has made Amazon's #1 natural disaster studies book. Thank you. And also, I continue to be interviewed by different press. I have been interviewed by Mississippi Press. I have been interviewed by New York Press, New Jersey Press, and Boston Press. So it's just taking off. I guess within 1 month, it's been September 24th since the book was released. So I think so far with the Amazon rating and the multiple interviews that I continue to get, and I have one that I was just contacted yesterday about another interview. So I think it's doing quite well. And for me, I'm not so concerned about the book sales. I'm more concerned that now the women's stories from Mississippi, survivors of Katrina, they are now a part of the official Hurricane Katrina narrative. Never again will the overlooked voices of Mississippi women be overlooked, because their voices are now out there for the world to read about. That is most important to me.
What do you want the reader to, once the reader pick the book up, what do you want them to get out of the book? What is it that what's the lesson, the message, the story? What is it that you would like for the reader to get?
Well, two things really. One is that all survivors' stories are important, not just one area. So look at all the survivor stories, whether regardless of class, ethnicity, or whatever the case may be. And then I want this audience to know that they need to interview women, Black women in particular. And when disaster researchers interview Black women, they need to listen to what they say, allow their voices to come forth, as I have tried to do here, reading some of their words, not just talking about their words all the time, but I wanted disaster researchers to listen to Black women, to not overlook them, then to listen to them, and then to let their stories come forth, because they are authentic, they're truthful, and they're helpful to the larger group of people who may survive disasters in the future. And then I wanted the general public to feel like they could pick up this book. It started out as 300 pages, and I had narrowed it down to a smaller book because I wanted anyone, anywhere, to pick this book up, to feel like they could get through it and read it and learn something from these women's experience that could apply to their lives. And speaking of the pandemic, one of the bits of feedback that I have gotten from women who've read this book, and men too, who've read this book, is this: in this moment of the pandemic, this book has lessons that we can learn from, and it encourages us to say, guess what? These women experienced Hurricane Katrina. They lost everything. They lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they didn't lose loved ones, but they lost their communities, they lost so much, but they kept going. And now they are resilient and they have recovered. So, in this moment of the pandemic, I've heard from people this book has been encouragement to them during the pandemic to keep going. So, that's another lesson learned.
I feel like, based on the book, I feel like anybody should be able to pick that book up and read those stories and say, you know what, I need to create a disaster plan for my life,
Yes.
because we just never know what's next. I'm not trying to speak that stuff into existence. It's just a fact. We never know what's next. And so I lost my mom to COVID. And that was one of the hardest thing I ever had to live through in my entire life. And um but I pushed through. You know, I do this show 4 days a week. She passed on January 5th, which was a Thursday, which is what I do the show 4 days a week. And I did my show that morning. She passed at 5:15, 10 o'clock. I was on the air. Now I was a mess, but I was still on the air because I realized I had to push through. And you're never prepared for this stuff when you don't prepare for this stuff, right? So I feel like people are going to be able to pick this book up. Listen, guys, go pick the book up from Amazon, pick the book up, and read the stories from the women. Read the stories and create a disaster plan, an emergency plan for your life. Because I feel like if you are just a little bit prepared, you won't be totally caught off guard. Would you agree?
I agree with you 100%. And yes, I definitely do.
So, what's next for you?
Well, when people ask me that right now, this book came out just a month ago. I am celebrating the fact that this story is now told. This book is now complete, and the women's stories are a part of the narrative. And I hope that after reading the book, people will see that, oh, there may be more to this story that I want to read sometimes in the future, because Hurricane Katrina's 20th anniversary is in just 5 years, actually 4 years now. So you never know what's coming down the pipe, but for now, I'm celebrating.
Celebrating, I get it. So if anyone wants to interview you, we know the book is on Amazon. Pick up your copy. Again, let me show you the cover. So go get your copy just in case you go, you don't get the. This is the book. If anybody wants to buy the book, I know they can go to Amazon, but if they want to talk to you to help you further the message and the mission, how can they contact you?
They can contact me at opheraadavis.com. Just like my name, just type in my name and my website will come up, and they can contact me there. Otherwise, they can, that's the best way to contact me. Just contact me at opheraadavis.com. Just Google my name, and there you have my website. And there's a contact link there. Just let me know what you want to do. I'm interested in book club readings. I'm interested in interviews like this, television interviews, whatever other folk have in mind.
All right. Well, I have a book club that I'm going to share the book with, and I told Sharon. So Sharon is her amazing publicist, y'all, and she has been busy trying to make sure she get this message out there about this book, so these women voices can be heard and not overlooked ever again. So, kudos to Sharon for being so proactive and helping her get the word out. I'm going to share the book with the book club here in Georgia, and I'm sure that they'll probably be in touch with Sharon to get more information about how to get copies of the books. I don't know how that whole thing works out, but I'll make sure to make the introduction.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So listen, thank you so much for being my guest. Continues the good work that you're doing, and continue to put the women's voices out there as much as you can. If I can ever do anything to help, please don't hesitate to come back to the Good Morning Gwinnett show or one of my other 5 podcasts. I don't know which one it could be at that time, but just reach out to Georgette and she'll be sure to find the one that you can come on next.
Thank you so much for having me as a guest.
You're welcome. All right, cool. So listen, guys, that's all I got for you today. I will be back again next week to bring you more of the Good Morning Gwinnett show. So be sure to tune in then. Remember, If you missed any episode of this show, go to goodmorninggwinnett.com. If you would like to support the show, go to goodmorninggwinnett.com. If you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, be sure to go there and find your favorite 2 episodes, give it 5 stars, leave, like, comment, and subscribe to the show as well. Also, follow me on Facebook at Good Morning Gwinnett. Follow me on Instagram at Good Morning Gwinnett, and follow me on the Twitter at GM Gwinnett1. GM Gwinnett, the number 1. I'll be back again Monday because today is my Friday. I'll be back again Monday at 10 a.m. with more about what's going on in and around Gwinnett County and another amazing guest. So listen, stay safe out there. Tell your family and friends you love them. And until next time, my friends, make it a great day. Bye, y'all.